Welcome to The Deep Dive, the place where we try to cut through complexity and give you the essential context.
And today we are wading into some deeply consequential territory.
It feels like it.
We're looking at this tension between classical Islamic rulings on apostasy, on violence, and then this really fundamental Quranic principle of freedom of belief.
Yeah, it's a charged collision of, theology, history, law.
And human rights. It's all in there.
We've got a stack of sources here that get into these core questions, especially around verses that are, always cited in discussions about violence. Things like Quran 4.89, 9.5.
And 9.29, yeah.
And the big question is, how do those square up with this really clear command in 2.256? There is no compulsion in religion.
Well, our mission here is to try and bring some clarity. We want to unpack the historical setting, the competing interpretations you see from classical jurists versus modern reformers.
Right.
And really help you understand the why behind these laws, why they emerged in the 7th century and why this is still such a challenge today.
So let's start with what feels like the immediate surprise. When people talk about a death penalty for leaving the faith, I think most of us assume it comes directly from those really specific Quranic verses.
Right.
But that's not quite right, is it? It's a bit of a category error.
It's a huge category error, absolutely.
Yeah.
The foundational legal ruling for the death penalty in classical Islamic law, it doesn't primarily come from those Quranic verses. It comes from a specific hadith.
A saying of the Prophet.
Exactly. A saying attributed to the Prophet, which states, whoever changes his religion, kill him.
Okay, that is a crucial distinction. The hadith gives the explicit rule, but the Quranic verses, they're more contextual. So let's dig into that. What about 4.89? Read cold. It talks about seizing and killing people who turn away.
Yeah, and you have to immediately put yourself in the military and political situation in Medina at the time. This verse wasn't directed at, someone having a private crisis of faith in their study.
Not a personal struggle?
Not at all. It targeted the munafiqun, the hypocrites. This was a specific political faction, a destructive internal fifth column. They were pretending to be loyal while actively trying to undermine the whole community from within.
So because the community was basically a new state trying to survive, the command to seize and kill is more like a wartime directive against active sedition.
That's the key classical interpretation. It's treason. And the verses right around it confirm this. 499, the very next verse immediately makes an exception for anyone who seeks peace.
Right. You wouldn't offer a peace deal if you're punishing a private belief.
Exactly. You do that when you're fighting a political enemy.
Okay, so what about the really notorious one, 9.5, the verse of the sword? That phrase alone carries so much weight.
It does. And it's so frequently ripped from its legal and historical context, it has nothing to do with apostasy. Nothing. It's about the mushrikun, the polytheists of Arabia. Specifically, the groups who had repeatedly broken treaties and were in a state of active war against the community in Medina. This command, it was the conclusion of a declared war, and it only came after a final 4-month truce had expired.
But I've heard the argument that it was about forced conversion. Why isn't that the case?
Because of the very next verse. Look at 9.6. It commands that if any of those same polytheists ask for protection, you have to grant it. You give them safe escort so that he may hear the word of Allah, and that you escort him to safety.
That doesn't sound like forced conversion.
It's the opposite. It shows the goal was managing a military conflict, not just violence for the sake of belief.
And the last one, 9.29, the one that brings up the jizya tax for Jews and Christians, the people of the book.
And again, this is purely political and administrative. It has nothing to do with apostasy. The jizya was a poll tax paid by non-Muslim subjects who were called dhimmi.
And what was it for?
It was paid in exchange for state protection and, crucially, exemption from military service, which was obligatory for all Muslim men. It was just a functional, if unequal by modern standards, framework for running a multi-religious state back then.
Okay, so we've established these specific harsh-sounding verses are about wartime politics and treason, not private faith. But that still leaves us with the hadith rule and this massive tension with there is no compulsion in religion. So which principle actually won out in classical law?
Well, that's the whole debate, isn't it? The consensus of the classical jurists, it all hinged on one fact. In the 7th century, the Ummah, the Muslim community, was a single, indivisible body. There was no separation of mosque and state.
So leaving the faith wasn't just a personal journey or a crisis of conscience. It was like breaking a political oath.
But precisely. Publicly renouncing Islam, or Ridda, was seen as the ultimate act of sedition and desertion. The punishment wasn't for the theological doubt in your head. It was for the political betrayal, the attempt to unravel the community. It was a law of treason.
It's so easy to make a category error there, applying our modern ideas of individual rights to a tribal pre-modern reality.
It is.
And that brings us to this great legal divide. You have the classical jurists, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali schools. They all pretty much upheld the death penalty, leaning on that hadith.
They did. They saw it as essential for state maintenance. And they had to figure out how to justify that ruling against the absolute clarity of 2.256.
Okay, so that's my question. If the Quran is so clear about no compulsion, how did they legally prioritize the hadith and the need for state control? I mean, doesn't that suggest they did, in fact, prioritize the harsher rule?
It's a really important question. They used a specific, a very powerful legal tool called abrogation.
Abrogation.
They argued that later verses, which were generally revealed in Medina where the state was being built, could supersede earlier, more peaceful commands revealed in Mecca. For them, protecting the ummah from fitna, from chaos and treason, was the highest possible priority. Abrogation was the legal key that let them do that.
Wow. That is a massive legal step to claim later verses can just void earlier, seemingly universal principles. So now you have modern reformers trying to basically reverse that. What's their counter-argument?
Well, modern scholars, people like Abdullah Said or Javed Amikamidi, they argue that the classical ruling is just. It's incompatible with the Quran's overall message and with the modern world.
So they're saying that abrogation was misused and those commands were tied specifically to 7th century warfare and were time-bound.
Exactly that. Their first defense is the primacy of 2.256. That's the universal timeless principle. And then critically, they point out that where the Quran does talk about apostasy, like in verse 2.217, the punishment it mentions is explicitly from God in the afterlife.
Not from the state on earth.
Right. So they conclude that the simple act of changing your religion, it should have no worldly state-sanctioned punishment at all.
The whole debate really does just hinge on that one question. Is this an eternal divine law or a time-bound political necessity? You know, it helps to zoom out here and see that this idea, punishing defection, it wasn't unique to Islam. It was the global political norm at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't invented out of thin air. When Islam emerged, the two superpowers right next to Arabia, the Byzantine Christian Empire, and the Sasanian Zoroastrian Empire, both treated apostasy and heresy as capital treason, a crime against the state.
So the Islamic ruling, as shocking as it is to our modern ears, was basically just adopting the established political expectation of the region, where your religion and your citizenship were, completely fused.
And that historical fact is why something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, it's just such a radical shift in human history. That guarantee of the freedom to change his religion or belief. Today, apostasy laws are, of course, widely condemned as a violation of fundamental human rights.
Which begs this, I guess, non-theological question. Why? Why did all of these early states, Christian, Zoroastrian, Islamic, it didn't matter, why did they all seem to require this kind of incredibly harsh law?
That's where you move past theology and into social science.
Yeah.
In these pre-modern tribal societies, a shared religion was the essential organizational glue. It was the operating system for the society. Without that shared identity and loyalty, the group just disintegrates.
So an apostate, from a sociological view, is a defector. They're breaking the social contract, and that threatens the whole group's cohesion. The law is just a pragmatic defense mechanism.
It creates a very high cost of leaving, both socially and legally. And that works brilliantly to reinforce in-group loyalty and deter defection. Now, modern psychology tells us that coercion only leads to fear and hidden beliefs, not genuine conviction.
Right.
But in a pure survival context, that fear-based conformity, it gives you the stability you need to survive existential threats.
So if you take away one thing from all this, it really should be that core collision. Is the classical ruling on apostasy an eternal divine law? Or is it a very specific, time-bound legal response to treason in a 7th century political state?
And the internal fight within Islam today is between those who say you have to contextualize scripture to the Prophet's era versus those who want to elevate that clear universal command of no compulsion as the ultimate legal framework for the modern world.
And the outcome of that debate is going to redefine how modern Islam engages with the entire global human rights movement.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given that capital punishment for apostasy was the global norm for every major empire in the 7th century, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Islamic, What does that tell us about the foundational, maybe even brutal requirements of any state just fighting for its political survival?
And how does our modern concept of a religiously neutral state fundamentally change the very meaning of treason today?